My guest is Tom Nichols, author of The Death of Expertise. I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused. You can find more commentary and analysis at the Tracinski Letter, tracinskiletter.com. You can like or subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to my podcast, and you can support us at Patreon, patreon.com/Salon of the Refused. So, Tom, you originally wrote the article, The Death of Expertise, in 2014, and the book came out in 2017. And I think a little something happened in between those two dates that may have made it a little more relevant.
What are you getting at here, Rob?
Was that?
So what are you getting at here, Rob? Well, it is interesting because one faulty assumption that people have made about the book is that I somehow wrote it as a response to Trump or Trumpism or Brexit or anything. Mm-hmm. As you know, I wrote it I wrote it as a blog piece, which I actually don't have a blog anymore because I realized that I was becoming part of the problem. But it was picked up by the Federalist and it was run there and it went viral. And I actually signed the contract with Oxford, I want to say in like early 2015, before any of this other stuff had happened. And I really didn't think that it was, I thought, it would be kind of a nice addition to a bookshelf. Some folks would read it. It might be reviewed nicely in a few places. I had no idea that it was going to turn into a thing. I mean, it's in, if I can just humble brag for a moment, it's in 11 foreign languages at this point. And I think...
I don't think that's a humble brag. I think that's just a plain brag.
That's a brag, yeah. Well, I love the humble brag format in real life. Well, I'm hesitant to point this out, but no, I'm not hesitant to point it out. It's in 11 foreign languages, which I think is cool, but it's also to me very surprising. And I guess it's more of a problem of the developed world than I thought it was. I mean, I was really surprised. I wasn't surprised by the book being a hit in Italy, for obvious reasons, because of what Italy's going through. I was really surprised when translation contracts were coming from places like Japan and Korea and China, where I thought, do Japanese universities have problems with really, troublesome, uppity students? So I was definitely taken aback by that, because it also struck me that, oh my God, this is a bigger problem than even I thought it was. But it really had very little to do with Trump. Now, the book became more popular, I think, because after Trump, after Brexit, after the Five-Star movement in Italy, after the rise of populism in other parts of Europe, people were asking, why is this happening? And so I think some people turned to the book as kind of, I know in Canada, when I was doing a lot of talks in Canada, Canadians told me that they felt they were having the same problems in their country, but they were also deeply interested to understand why the election had happened, even though I didn't really talk about the election in any detail.
Right. Well, one of the moments that stuck out for me on this issue was I don't know if it's late 2015 or early 2016, Donald Trump did an interview where he got a whole bunch of different facts wrong. And there are basically a bunch of people, and this is about important foreign policy issues and who the leaders are and the nuclear triad and all sorts of things, really important stuff that the president's going to be in charge of. And there was a whole argument that, well, that doesn't really matter. It's not important that he got that wrong. And yeah. I think that it's the idea of unleashing the, there's always, I'm going to put it this way, but the question I have is Trump really that much worse? Because politicians have always had a tendency to, go out and say things and try to seem sober and serious and then do whatever they think the voters want or do whatever they think will pander to the right constituency. Has Trump unleashed something that's more than that, where he doesn't even feel the need to pretend to listen to the experts?
Yes, Trump is that bad.
Well, the way I think about it is, it used to be you had somebody's running for office. They would go give the populist barn-burning speeches, but then they'd also do a talk at the Heritage Foundation where they tried to show that they really knew what they were talking about on the policy issues. And that seems to have been sort of a thing of the past now.
As I always tell my students, I used to call the president's daily brief the oh shit book, right? That, you say all these things in parking lots and, in front of a Walmart about what you're going to do in foreign affairs and, we're going to get even with the bad guys and we're going to solve our, and then they come in and they give you the classified stuff on, the really super classified stuff on day one. And the president looks down and goes, oh shit. And I think, there's a learning curve that presidents go through in office, some faster than others. I don't think, although people now think that I'm retroactively some huge President Obama fan, I thought that President Obama's learning curve was relatively flat on foreign affairs because he just wasn't that interested in it.
Right, right.
But he made the effort to, actually learn stuff. And there were some bad calls and some good calls, but they were real calls. They weren't just drift and default. And I think that the president...
I'll defend George W. Bush on that. I think for all the bad things people say about him, I did see evidence that he was really trying hard and taking things in. And for example, the surge was something he had no idea he need. The counterinsurgency was something he had no understanding of, no idea he needed to do when he went in, and he was listening to Don Rumsfeld. And so
there's a real debate. There's a real debate inside that administration among people who knew their stuff. Mm-hmm. This is something else one of my expert science friends tells me not to drink, but I drink it anyway. So one thing I share in common with the president. But I think the President Trump has taken this really a lot further by saying, I just don't need briefings. Yesterday or a couple of days ago, I think Jim Comey, who, of course, people who hate Comey will dismiss this, but you'll hear it from other folks that have tried to brief Trump, that he just doesn't. He talks, he doesn't listen, and that his interest in things is mostly how they pertain to his administration, to him. That's having briefed several politicians in my life. There are two kinds. There are people who listen, and there are people who don't. And the ones who don't talk a lot, and it's there are narcissistic politicians. I think that's very dangerous in a president of the United States, because there are so many issues that require at least some attention to detail. Now, I'm not arguing that we should go back to Jimmy Carter levels of micromanaging detail, but there has to be something between that and I don't know what a nuclear triad is, and I don't care because it's not important. Because that, I think, is one of the things where the president has really pushed this over the line to say, not only do I not know about it, but if I don't know about it, it's not worth knowing.
Well, I think this gets to point you made earlier, that when you sort of have this total populism, it tends to actually default to rule by experts. Because, I think I look at our foreign policy and realize that I don't think Trump is managing the day-to-day details of much of our foreign policy. A lot of that is, maybe John Bolton's doing things and Kelly's doing, General Kelly is doing things.
Or deputy assistant secretaries of state.
Right, exactly. It's all going back to the bureaucrats and the guys, the cabinet officers or the guys below the cabinet officers.
I think I just saw a statistic here in mid-December that as of this point, Pompeo hasn't even filled like 4 out of 6 undersecretary slots. The people who argue that, well, the deep state is thwarting the president owns the deep state. He can reappoint people. We are not a in fact, let me put in a plug here for people to stop using that term, because the deep state really refers to the way we used to refer to Turkey in the 50s or 60s.
That's where it came from. It came from the Turkish context.
This permanent, power bureaucracy that couldn't be replaced. The president can replace all of those people tomorrow, and the bureaucracy will go in the direction they steer it. I think a huge amount, I've said this before, I've written about it, I think that the United States is in kind of zombie mode, where the bureaucrats and the second or third tier appointed officials are just kind of making the paper go around and keeping the lights on, because there is no foreign policy. Whenever people ask me what they think of Donald Trump's foreign policy, my answer is always to say, I don't know what it is.
I would have said the same thing about Obama. I think we've been kind of a little rudderless and disengaged really since 2006. I would say that, that was when the American people decided I've washed my hands of Iraq. I don't care what goes on there anymore. And since then, I mean, whenever I write something about foreign policy, it sinks like a rock because nobody wants to talk about it.
It's interesting. I think the one thing you can say about the coherence of Barack Obama's foreign policy is that it was coherent, and that was bad. Because the Iran deal in particular, I think when future histories of the Obama administration foreign policy are written, the Iran deal is going to be the tree from which all the other rotten fruit falls. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to I don't think we truly understand at this point how many bad things we were doing to keep the Iran deal alive, that we weren't calling out the Russians, we weren't going up against the Chinese, we didn't go head to head with the Syrians, because there was one coherent motivating idea, and that is that America should not be in the Middle East, that our influence is bad, that we should scale back our influence and kind of hand it over to regional hegemons, which is a kind of, textbook graduate student level liberal foreign policy. Right. And you can argue with whether it was wise, but I think in retrospect, I look back and say, these were people who had a view, and they tried to put that view into motion. I think that the place where the expert and elite criticism is most powerfully made on Obama is he knew how unpopular that would be with the American people, and so he didn't really tell them. He just said, we need to get out of the Middle East. I need to kind of offload all this to the Iranians and let the Russians kind of do what they're going to do. And no one's really going to buy that, so I'm just going to kind of not tell them that's what I'm doing.
But that does go back to the role of the people in this, which is, I think, the public, he was able to do that because the public was very disengaged. They decided they didn't want to pay attention to the world right now.
And that if Barack Obama had given a big speech about foreign policy, I don't know that would have, as you say, these kinds of things after 2006 landed with a thud. And I don't think anybody really wanted to hear about a big vision for foreign policy. It was, again, kind of just make it all go away, fix things, get us home, keep the world at bay. And I think the disservice that candidate Trump performed was to go to the American people and say, this is really easy to do. I'll just do it.
Yeah.
I alone can fix this. And but 3 months in, all this, your problems are over. And, that's, as we're learning the hard way, maybe we're going to have another summit with North Korea. That TV, I think the president thinks that things are just fixable by wanting them the way powerful rich men think. If I just want it badly enough and I spread enough green around, it'll just get done. Right, and that's not how the world works.
Right. So you and I are both in the sort of category, I'm not pushing back much on your criticisms of President Trump, because you and I are both in the category of being, never Trump people on the right. Basically, the question I have, though, is what has really happened to Never Trump? What direction does it have? I think it's sort of lost a little bit of direction, and we're sort of out wandering in the wilderness, and sometimes wandering a little randomly. I mean, I'm thinking of people like, I've been a little annoyed by Max Boot recently because, he's a Never Trump guy who now says, oh, and I was wrong to ever be on the right in the first place, and seems to really not. I think there are some people, or Jennifer Rubin is a great example of this, where she changed her positions on some things because in order to be on the other side from Donald Trump. I mean, it was, I guess, Never Trump was always a negative, something defined by a negation. Is there a direction on the right that leads in a direction other than Trump that is active and having an impact now?
That's a really interesting question. I think of Max and Jen as representing two different streams in Never Trump. One is, I think in Max's case, it's a perfect, and obviously I don't speak for Max or Jennifer Rubin or anybody else, but my sense of their writing is, like in Max's case, he's saying, look, I was wrong to trust the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. And I was wrong to trust that the party would come to its senses. If I was wrong about that, what other things that I trusted in the Republican Party are also wrong? And he's going back and saying, I'm taking an inventory. And this is kind of like the leftists did. I mean, I think of people like David Horowitz, who went from being crazy leftist to being crazy rightist. But there was a time where David was there was a time in the 70s and the early 80s when you could see that Horowitz was kind of thinking through, like, I believed all these things. If I was wrong about that, what else was I wrong about?
Right.
And I think that's a really healthy inventory. I don't agree with every position Max has kind of 180'd on, but
wasn't he a little bit more of a sort of a national security conservative and not as engaged on the other issues? I
would argue, and this includes you and others, me and Max, Bill Kristol, that the national security conservatives were the heart of NeverTrump, because that was the place, I think, where you really saw where this is more than just a lark. This is like really, really dangerous. Now, there were people who were NeverTrump, I think, because they were values conservatives. I think of somebody like Peter Wehner,
right?
Who says this is not a healthy person.
Well, that's been the most disappointing category of them, though, because those were the first people to switch over. I would say, as much as I was a national,
we should be clear, not Wehner. I mean, he has been.
I know
he has stayed course on that. So I think you have people like Max who are saying, if I was wrong about this, and I was wrong to invest my faith in the party, in this, what else was I wrong about? I think some of the things where I think Rubin's been criticized unfairly is that it's not that we don't want some of the things Trump is doing. We don't want them the way he's determined to get them. Okay, that and I grant you, all of the NeverTrumpers, this. We've all had that oppositional defiance issue of, well, Trump says this, it must be bad, and I tried to not fall into that, but.
It is a temptation sometimes.
Pardon?
It is a temptation sometimes, I'll admit.
Well, because, the president's personality is such that he says good morning, and you're like, what is that? What's up with that? President's a very confrontational guy. But I think that there is a problem with people saying, well, don't you want the embassy, moved to Jerusalem? The answer is not this way. Don't you want, a better relationship with North Korea to lessen the danger? Not like this.
Right.
I mean, that's like saying, do I want safe streets? Well, not by, putting cameras on every corner and, having police shoot first and ask questions later. There are things that you want that you can still disagree with because of the way they're being implemented. So I tend to think that there are a group of conservatives who, and I think Rubin is more emblematic of that, of the people saying, look, there are a lot of things I would have liked, but I don't like that it's being done this way. And I think the other thing, and I think this covers a larger group of NeverTrumpers who say, look, anything that legitimizes all of these other compromises is something we're going to push back against. When people say to me, do you object to Neil Gorsuch? No, I don't object to I did object to Kavanaugh. But, do I object to Neil Gorsuch? No. He's a perfect – that would have been the first nomination in a Rubio or a Bush 45 or whoever. I mean, it's a pretty standard Republican pick. But do I think that therefore that I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to let the Gorsuch nomination outweigh this incredible damage to our constitutional system? I had this argument with Hugh Hewitt during the campaign where I said getting judges doesn't compensate you for losing all the other rights and for all the other damage to the constitutional norms. They are not comparable. They're not put on the same scale.
Well, and I argue by the same argument, the but judges argument, you'd have to excuse everything that Mr. Establishment Mitch McConnell has done, because that's been the thing he runs on every couple of years to become majority leader is, oh, well, judges are the most important thing, and so it's okay if we blow the budget and we have huge deficits and we all the other problems all the other things we don't do are okay because we voted in judges.
And this is really some serious flim-flammery. I sound really 19th century saying that, but it's flim-flammery, I tell you.
Balderdash.
It's balderdash. It's poppycock. Because what that wing of the Republican Party has done is to say, because when they say judges, let's talk about what we really mean, abortion.
Right.
And so they're saying, look, as long as you were anti-abortion, that position makes you so morally good that everything else is excusable. And I think that's ridiculous. Abortion is a tormented subject for any thinking American of conscience on the right or the left. I always liked the formulation by an old leftist colleague of mine who said something to the effect of, always a tragedy, sometimes a sin, never a crime. I wouldn't even go as far as saying never a crime, sometimes a crime. But this notion that if you just say, well, it's the Jedi mind trick, abortion, and so, okay, everything else, nothing matters.
Right.
And I think that has been a very effective and cheap ploy on the right for a long time. And I think Trump figured that out and he sold it.
Well, it's something I noticed during the Kavanaugh hearings is that I was pro-Kavanaugh, but there was this like almost era of good feelings for a couple of weeks where all the conservatives were on the same, or most of it, not you, but most of us were on the same side again. And like, hey, we got the band back together. Everybody's not fighting. But what I found that happened afterwards was this was used as an excuse by a lot of pro-Trump people to say, look, see, you're all happy about Kavanaugh, therefore you have to accept Trump, and never-Trumpers are irrelevant, and I was out of a job a couple weeks later.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't, not saying it's a direct cause and effect, but there was that sense that because Trump delivered on this one thing, that excuses everything else, and therefore invalidates people who've been criticizing him on all the other things.
I don't know the details of your case, but I think for a lot of people it was, if we can't get you on board with Kavanaugh, then there's no reasoning with you.
Exactly, and that was sort of the attitude, yeah.
And, for me, I was not anti-Kavanaugh. In fact, I took a lot of static for changing my position because my first reaction was very much a middle-aged guy reaction to say, 17 years old, is this really that important? And my wife said to me, you're not a woman. If this guy really did attempt to hurt a girl at 17 years old, that's going to matter to women who have to accept the legitimacy of his positions. Mm-hmm. Even at that point, I said that, therefore, it is worth looking into this to determine if this man has this kind of history. If he doesn't, then he's pretty much a standard, again, another kind of standard Republican pick. Where I defected from Kavanaugh and where I was disappointed that other conservatives did not was in that appalling eruption before the Senate Judiciary Committee, where he really did kind of throw the cloak off and say, I am partisan. I will get even with every one of you. Even though, I understood he was charged with something horrible and his emotions were running high, but he wrote that statement out a day before. I mean, he said what he intended to say.
Well, I think
after that, I just said, this is not a person whose temperament belongs on the Supreme Court. And the conservatives, when Susan Collins got up there and said, all you peons shut up and get in line because we're the United States Senate and the Republican Party and the Senate are the important institutions in this country, that was when I finally decided I was out.
Well, I think we can take different interpretations of that, but I think that the national security conservative, you said the national security conservatives or the national security right has been the heart of Never Trump, and I think that's the issue that binds most of us together, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask about, which is part of your area of expertise is Russia. What is going on with Russia? I mean, what's the big picture here? Which is, I'm skeptical of the more conspiracy theory-ish views of what collusion consisted of, but there's definitely this sense that Trump is more in line with the geopolitical goals of Russia, or more complacent or compliant with them. Can you talk a little bit about what is the situation with Russia? What do they want? What are they trying to do? And how does that connect to our policy or lack thereof?
I almost feel like I don't need to make this argument anymore. 6 months ago, you would ask me questions like that, and I would say, well, here's what I think is going to happen. Here's what I think is going to come out based on my background, with Russia. I'm almost to the point now when I talk to pro-Trump people about this to say, if you're not there now, you're just never going to get there. I mean, that Mueller could come out with a tape tomorrow of, like No Way Out, where the president just starts speaking fluent Russian, and somebody calls him Yuri. Yeah. And people are going to say, oh, well, fake news, the MSM, that's probably an MSNBC thing. Look, I wrote a piece a while back about something Jonathan Chait wrote, where I said, because Chait basically did a big piece where he said, Trump is an agent of the Russian Federation. And I said, that's just not right. But I think Che connected a lot of dots that were correct. So what I think is this. I think the Russians invested a lot of time and attention in Donald Trump over the course of 30 years. They did what regimes like that do. They played to his ego. They pulled him into a lot of really shady financial deals that compromised him legally and financially and made him dependent on their goodwill. There's a way that people can get you to betray things where you don't even think you're doing it. You think you're just being a friend. You think you're just being a good guy. That's really what people have, this very Hollywood image of what being compromised looks like, that someone walks in and says, they throw the 8x10s on your desk, or they, hold up the tape recorder and they say, now you belong to us, and instead I think for a lot of people, it's much more subtle. They say, help us help you to help your country.
Right.
Help us to, you're just like this thing that just came out a few days ago where Felix Sater says to one of the Trump folks, we'll make a lot of money and make the world more peaceful at the same time. Isn't that great? And so I think that the president has all these things in mind. I think that's made him terrified. First of all, I think he did not level with the American people during the election, which I think is huge.
About the deals he had going on with Russia.
About the deals. I'm not even talking about look, the president's been implicated. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to say the president's guilty or not guilty of anything. It seems to me, as a layperson, the president's been implicated in at least 2 felonies with the campaign finance stuff. I am leaving all that aside. The president during the campaign was not honest with the American people about the depth of his contacts with Russia or his agenda with Russia, financially or personally. He, since then, I think that his White House has not been honest about the degree of interaction between the campaign and after the campaign with agents of the Russian Federation. And I think it's because the president is, I think after the Helsinki summit, it should have been clear, the president's pretty afraid of Vladimir Putin and what Putin could reveal about him financially, that he's not really a billionaire, that he really is, the king of debt, that I don't think it's anything as salacious as sex. The president clearly does not seem to be bothered by revelations about his personal. But I think that, there's a lot about the money here that the president does not want to come out. And I think that there are a lot of people who have compromised themselves by having conversations with Russians that if I had them, I would have called the FBI.
Right.
These are you don't, when someone calls and says, I have dirt on your opponent, you don't say, hey, I would take that meeting. You call the FBI and you say, listen, a foreign national has called me and tried to insert himself into our elections. Mm-hmm. It's that simple. And none of that happened. So I think that now I think what's actually happened is the Russians were victims of their own success. I don't think they ever expected things to get this far. I think they vastly overestimated the intelligence of the people around the president himself. I think they had the president's number. I think they are just, when you really look at this, guys like Paul Manafort and General Flynn and others, it's just astonishing. So I think the Russians thought that they were doing this initially to undermine a future Hillary Clinton presidency.
Right.
They kind of went along for the ride because it was a laugh. It was a great gig. And now I think they're kind of done with him and saying, we're tired of having our networks exposed. We're tired of having our connections put under spotlight. We're tired of not knowing who to deal with in the United States about important stuff that we want to get done. And I think that the pro-Trump people who are still holding on to this is all just a big deep state conspiracy and it's a lot of nonsense being put together by the mainstream media. I don't know how they sustain the caloric expenditure that level of a suspension of disbelief requires. And I think it's just going to get harder in the next few months.
Well, I think we also, we can remember from the Cold War how the Russians did it, that it was not just, the operation wasn't just about compromising individual people, but it was also, there was an ideological element. And I think that's the thing that disturbs me the most, is the extent to which nationalism as an ideology has come to the fore. and that there's sort of a sympathy for the way Vladimir Putin is doing things in his own country is a model, or is a good model for how we should be doing things here. That we should have our identity as a Christian country and that sort of thing, and that the nationalistic approach. And that raises, I think, the question I want to end on, which is, what's the alternative? Where do we go from here in terms of sort of restoring the right to what it traditionally was, or is that even possible?
I don't know if it's possible. I think, the way the Russians have pursued this, it almost makes me miss the old Soviet Union, because they had a very distinct ideology. They pushed it quite literally, and it made it easier to deal with them because their ideology was such risible bullshit.
And it was so alien. It was so alien to all American traditions, right?
Yeah, work with us. We are creating a classless society of great bureaucrats. No, thank you. I had enough of that. But this pushing of nationalism is meant. You always have to remember the Russian regime is a mafia. And so anything that makes other regimes sink to the level of the Russian regime is good for them, because it makes them be able to push the line that they are normal, that they are just like any other regime in the world.
Well, I think specifically they want to push the idea that all the stuff about liberal democracy, it is an illusion, it's a lie.
What everybody needs is a anti-gay, pro-Christian, anti-Muslim, state capitalist strongman.
Right.
Which, is kind of where we've been headed for a few years here. Where the right goes after this is really a hard call, because I think one thing that the right could do to reclaim its heritage as a truly conservative movement, and one place where it is in direct opposition to the Trumpers, is to start from the principle of limited government. The conservative movement, such that it is, that was co-opted by the Republican Party, which was in turn co-opted by Trump, is just as statist and just as leader-centric as the Democratic Party and the leftist movement. There's a liberal professor at Columbia named Mark Lilla, who in his criticism of Obama said, liberals need to get past the idea that the president is daddy. Well, conservatives have gladly picked that up and said the president is Big Daddy. He's the boss. He's the guy that solves everybody's problem. That is a fundamentally unconservative view. To regard not just the national government, but the executive branch of the national government as the source of all solutions to problems in American life. So I think if Republicans could get back to the idea that the things that unite us as conservatives, I shouldn't say Republicans, as conservatives, because I'm just done with the Republicans, but the thing that could unite conservatives is a fixed idea of human nature. This is someplace where we disagree with liberals. We don't think human nature can be remade by wise policy. We take the founders' approach that you institute government because men are not angels. So we start from this fixed notion of human nature, limited government, patriotism rather than nationalism. That is, you love your country because of what your country is, not where it's located or who's controlling its DNA. I took a lot of crap for saying that nationalism is basically the worship of a chromosome, but it is. Patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is love of country for an idea because of what your stands for.
Yeah,
nationalism is love of country because of who was born there.
Well, I like to point out that if we had been nationalists, we would never have become an independent country, because our national identity was we were British.
I remember a student asking me many years ago, we were talking about the American Revolution and whether or not victory was inevitable. And the student said, well, of course Americans were going to throw off British oppression. What would it even have looked like if we had chosen not to do that? And there was this kind of silence in the room for a minute where somebody leaned over and said, Canada? It's like, we didn't have another option. I said, the Queen is still on their money.
Yeah.
Had this other option. But I think that nationalism, and I really think that the conservatives, some of the guys at National Review and a few other places who have said, let's think about nationalism. It's not such a bad thing. Yes, it is. I mean, we've killed good, nationalism rivals communism for sheer body count at this point, from the 20th century onward. And while there were people who have challenged me by saying, well, nationalism brought down the Soviet Union. Yes, nationalism helped to bring down the Soviet Union. And how's that? The Soviet Union's gone. I'm glad for that. But how's that nationalism thing now working out in the former Soviet areas? Not so good. I mean, I don't want this to be remembered as the interwar period. Like there's that relative time of peace from 1991 to the early 21st century. Yeah. And the worship of nationalism, I think the sooner conservatives rise against that and to say what we care about is the Constitution, the rule of law, limitations on government, basic human freedom, both at home and abroad. We used to be all about freedom. And instead of, that the great father in Washington will solve all of our problems. But that there has to be a schism in the Republican Party and on the right. And then there has to be a similar shaking out, something we can talk about another time because it's long, but there has to be a similar shaking out on the left.
Right. Well, I do take heart from one thing, which is I just saw an article, I think it was in The Atlantic, someone on the left hyperventilating about all the emergency powers that have been granted to the president over the years. And I am thinking, a lot of these were things that were given to him by legislation passed by Democrats because they wanted to be able to do something, and let's give emergency power to the president to do it. And now, because the wrong guy has the emergency power, they're against it. I'm kind of take heart from the hope that something similar like that will happen on the right, that will rediscover the virtues of limited government when Bernie Sanders is president, will rediscover the virtues of limited government and individual rights and limiting the power of government.
Well, if we can work in one more movie reference, all I can say to the Democrats on that is, welcome to the party, pal. That for years, Republicans were we're going along with increasing the strength of the executive branch because Democrats were more than happy to do it because they never thought there would be a day when progressive Democrats weren't in power. The past 20 years, I think you look at people like Harry Reid and Barack Obama, and they governed as though nobody else was ever going to govern in their place. And if part of the outcome of the Trump era is that Democrats have rediscovered things like federalism, the importance of local control. I mean, it's really great to hear people saying, well, I'm in California and we'll never go along with those federal regulations. And I sit back and say, well, that's what it took to make you understand the importance of having a state capital. Then, I suppose there's one positive thing that comes out of it.
Well, I think this is the system working as it's supposed to, that everybody is, when the other side gets power, everybody has an interest suddenly in reigning in that power. And hopefully that will continue to keep us from sliding too far. Well, my guest today has been Tom Nichols, the author of The Death of Expertise. And thanks so much, Tom, for coming to talk with me. It
was great to see you again, Rob. Thanks for having me.
I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused. Again, you can find more commentary and analysis at the Tracinski Letter, tracinskiletter.com. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the podcast, and support us on Patreon, patreon.com/Salon of the Refused. Thank you for listening.